Welcome to Between the Lines, where we explore the intersection of local and national issues. I'm your host, Eben Diskin, editor of the Townie, and today we're talking about protests and civil disobedience, from local protests like the local No Kings rallies to what's going on in Minnesota and more nationally. It's a complicated subject, obviously, but we are joined today by Lois Ascher and Patty Myers to help us discuss. Lois is a retired professor in the Department of Humanities at Wentworth Institute and the university's first female professor. She taught literature, history, and urban culture studies. And Patty Myers came of age during the Vietnam War and civil rights movements, helped organize anti-Vietnam protests in Washington, D.C., and wrote an underground newspaper in college. She joined the Newburyport Democratic City Committee in 2016 and serves on the Rally Committee, helping organize local protests. Thanks for being here, guys. We appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting us.
Of course.
Thanks for having us.
So, obviously, this is a complicated subject, and I wanted to do it because I personally have a lot of questions and uncertainties about it. I obviously think that the right to protest is one of the most important rights we have as American citizens and should be celebrated, no matter what side of the issue that you're on. But I also know there comes a time when protesting becomes dangerous or counterproductive. So let's start there. What factors need to be in place, do you guys think, to make an issue worthy of protest in the first place? What makes people stop complaining about the government to their friends and coworkers and actually get off the couch and make a sign and march down to the mall? What's that line that needs to be crossed to get people to do that?
Can I say what Brenda said, which is not exactly an answer, but is part of that picture? Mm-hmm. And I was there with you in Vietnam protest. Mm-hmm. I actually got off the couch and marched pregnant under a sign that my sister made, Fetuses for Peace. But, you know, Justice Brandeis said in one of his court cases that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty. And I think, and it's interesting, that was 1927. 1998, this is where I found it, on the jury assembly room at the Moakley Courthouse. I think that's what it has to come to. It has to be at a point where people realize that their freedom is being menaced. Mm-hmm. That as Americans, and I think we're born differently maybe than in other countries. I think before we even have consciousness, we have all of the things that created this country inside ourselves. It's just part of who we are. And I think that when it happens, that we begin to recognize that that's at risk, you get off the couch. I mean, I think people get off the couch before that, but I think the ones who didn't get off the couch begin to think about it.
And I agree with what you said, but I also, from personal experience, I remember looking at the TV and watching the civil rights protesters being beaten and bitten by police dogs. And we used to get Life and Look magazine, which was a weekly magazine, incredibly enough, at the time. Mm-hmm. It was started in the late 30s, I believe. So in the 50s, when I was young, I look at the pictures and I think, how can this be happening? And I felt as a child, wow, there's nothing I can do. I feel helpless, but I wonder if I'd be brave enough to be out there marching and trying to stop this horrible stuff that's going on. So that was my personal reaction when I was a child, and I think as an adult, when the Vietnam War occurred, one of my boyfriends at the time was his number was pulled, but he wasn't called. He had a high number, but it was like we all breathed a sigh of relief. It really affected people personally, and at that point, that's when I became involved as well. So, you know, I think it's different things for different people.
Well, and let's I want to get back to the Vietnam part in a bit, but let's start by defining protest, because we treat it like this monolithic concept, but it means different things to different people. So, to you guys, what does it mean to protest? And then we can get into civil disobedience, which is a form of protest as well.
I'm not sure what you're asking when you say, what does it mean to protest?
So what is the act of protest? What catalyzes a protest? What motivates people to do it? What does it mean? Is it just, it's not just going out there and standing and holding a sign. It can be, some stores closed in solidarity with Minnesota and economic blackout. That's a form of protest. So, just for you guys, until we define for the audience, what in your mind, what is a protest?
I think you're trying to address publicly an injustice or an issue that you care deeply about, and you're trying to do something about it in some way, and expressing your opinion about it and hoping others will join you.
Yeah, and I think also when you begin to see two things, one is a threat to the things that you believe in. Hopefully those things that you believe in are justice. And the second one, I think, happens when more people get out there. I think I'm a little older than you are. And when I was protesting at the beginning of Vietnam, I was saying to myself, I was living in Boston on Beacon Hill, so I'd be down at the Common. It was easy to get to. And I'd be saying to myself, nobody's here, but I'm going to keep coming. Well, after a while, because people kept coming, other people paid attention. And I think that Heather Cox Richardson, whom I read almost every day, and I watched one of her shows last night. Normally I just read her. And she was talking about that, about how things are beginning. There's some hope because there are cracks forming. And the cracks are forming because more and more people, first of all, are upset at what's going on, but secondly, see their fellow citizens out there. I don't know. I think that's important.
And I thought this morning, too, about how years ago when the church sexual abuse scandal started, there was one guy. His last name was Lynch. And it was, I think, 2000. And he stood outside one of the churches in Boston for 40 days, every single day, holding a sign saying that he was a victim of this. And all by himself. And then gradually, people started joining him. And then what happened? It became a major scandal, and the church started to address some of the issues. So one person can make a difference, and I see that also with other protests too. Certainly, Martin Luther King is a sample or an example that I look up to.
No, go ahead, Lois.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that sometimes all it takes is one person to stand up and say something about the way in which they've been treated, and that provides courage for other people to stand up, not just people outside the situation, but in the case that you're talking about, others who have been sexually harassed, whether it's by the church or sexual harassment against women, for example. There's this code of silence that goes on because the victim feels at risk for speaking very often. So when there's that one courageous person, the guy that you're talking about, Lynch, was his name?
His last name was Lynch. Yeah.
Or Martin Luther King, who is at a different level, obviously, in terms of his notoriety. But when someone is willing to stand up and say, this is happening, I think it encourages other people. It gives them the courage to speak.
And to stand up against power. And I don't think Martin Luther King was very popular at the time when he first started. And certainly this young man was rattling, the establishment, so...
Well, if nothing else, it gives people a sense that other people share their frustrations, even if it doesn't immediately lead to actionable change. People who might not even want to get out there, might not feel comfortable demonstrating or protesting, who have frustrations with the status quo, can see other people, see the images on the news, see people when they drive down the street and say, okay, at least there are people who stand for my point of view and are speaking out for that point of view.
And it creates a sense of community. even if you're not
Absolutely.
out there joining the community.
Yeah.
You feel connected.
Yeah.
And that
absolutely.
connectivity really helps you to get out there or to feel less isolated.
And
So
I feel too, it's also a reality check. I mean, we're constantly being gaslighted by our government right now, in my opinion. And when you meet with other people, like-minded people, you realize, okay, I'm not crazy, you know. This is really happening, and it's not normal. It's not right. And so that's important too. And it's kind of like a form of therapy too,
Yeah.
you know.
When I talk to people after the No Kings protest, or the most recent one, the one that got a ton of people coming out to the Mall, that's the number one thing I heard from them. I would ask, like, oh, what did you think, or how did you feel it went? And the number one thing I heard from everybody was, it was so nice to feel like I'm part of this big community and
Right.
solidarity. And I think that's maybe not the stated goal of a protest. The goal is to affect change, but I think what happens is, as a byproduct, is you create this sense of community and bonding, and it's almost becomes a third space in the community.
And that's
Right.
that's what creates the change too. You know, when you feel that there are other people out there with you, it's you're taking things one step at a time. You're standing back. I don't know, but look at all those people. Oh, maybe I'll step forward. Oh my gosh, there's people just like me out here. Maybe I'll step forward again. You know, I went to the one, the No Kings protest. When was it? In October? Yeah, and I was just getting over COVID, and I wasn't going to go, not because I was going to make people sick, but because I was feeling awful. So I made a deal with myself. You'll go to the second half. I knew I couldn't stay out here the whole time. I thought I'd be there 10 minutes, but just to make sure I showed up.
Right. You felt it was important to be there,
Right.
bear witness to.
Right.
Yeah.
But being there with those people created the strength, you know, the physical ability to keep going and to stay the rest of the time. And I think it was the people. If I was out there by myself or taking a walk by myself, I wouldn't have had that. But that gave me, I don't know, a sense of power. And I don't mean in terms of protest, but just being able to manage. And I think that brings people forward beyond what they think they can do.
Yeah.
You know, it gives them courage.
And
And I
belonging.
meet people at demonstrations now. You know, we have our weekly demonstrations that are sponsored by the City Democratic Committee. And I always meet one or two people, and it's their first time attending a demonstration. I'm thinking, all right, you know, that's great. That's the first step. So that's
Yeah,
encouraging.
the sense of community is a powerful thing, and I think, you know, you can even say the same thing on, you look at Trump rallies, right? When he was doing huge rallies, when he started to run for president in 2016, I think a lot of people gravitated towards that because they felt, more so than his policies, because of the sense of community. It wasn't a political candidate with a platform, it was a movement, and people like being part of a movement. And I think you can find that in different examples throughout history, but I think protests are a form of belonging to a movement that do align with your ideology, but you can go as an individual and leave feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself, and I think
Exactly. Yeah.
that's a really powerful feeling.
Yes. Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about civil disobedience, which is popularized by Thoreau, which Lois knows a little bit about, as a form of protest and historic perspective on civil disobedience and how we see it in today's political climate. So if you want to talk a little bit about civil disobedience, Thoreau. What is it?
Well, I mean, civil disobedience is what it exactly sounds like. You know, Thoreau talks about our responsibility not to follow the government. I actually may have a quote on that, which would be better than what I'll be faster if I can find it.
Civil disobedience isn't necessarily lawful. It's peaceful, but it's not necessarily
Right,
lawful,
right. And-
Whereas a protest like the No Kings protest, those
Right.
protesters are lawful.
Right.
They're standing and they're holding a sign. So there's an important difference. I just want to state that.
Yeah,
up front.
so one of the things he says in his essay on civil disobedience is action from principle the perception and the performance of the right changes things and relations. And he sticks to that idea throughout. You know, he went, supposedly, he didn't pay his poll tax, ended up in prison to disobey. And I don't know if this is true. The story is that Emerson showed up and said, "What are you doing in there, Henry?" And Thoreau looked at him and said, "What are you doing out there, Ralph?" You know.
Good.
Yeah, and I, you know, he also says in the same essay, law never made a man a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are made the agents of injustice. So he makes a distinction. We have it now, going on right now, with laws that aren't just, with behavior that's not just, with a government that's behaving unjustly, at least some of us think that, or many of us think that. And so you have to make that distinction. He made it for us. It continues on. You know, you have a responsibility. I'm sort of, he doesn't exactly say this, but he implies it, to connect with your moral sense. Your moral sense. You have responsibility to investigate, not just to accept what someone tells you is right or wrong.
So it's almost that unjust behavior from the government or unjust laws justify a certain degree of unlawful response. Is that accurate?
He says essentially that when the law is unjust, you have no responsibility to follow it.
Exactly.
He doesn't say, or he says it differently, he says you don't have a responsibility to break it if that's not what you want to do, but you have a responsibility not to follow it, not to go along with it.
How do we interpret that in the current climate we're in, where we have such varied perceptions of what laws are just and what laws aren't just? And you might poll 50% of the country that would disagree with the other half of the country on what laws are just or unjust, and therefore would morally be okay to break those laws.
Martin Luther King, I think it's in the letter from Birmingham jail,
Yeah.
says it. He says, I just forgot what I was going to say. Just laws are sameness made legal. Unjust laws are difference made legal. Now that opens up a whole amount of interpretation. And that interpretation, in part, is dependent on our ability to look at ethics and morality and ourselves and begin to question. But if you see, as Petty did, a woman being thrown to the ground and beaten, I don't think you have to go very far into your moral sense to know there's something wrong with that. If you see 7 people grabbing someone and disarming him and then shooting him 10 times, I don't think you have to be a genius to figure out there's a problem there.
And I think the other part of civil disobedience that Martin Luther King wrote about was he mentioned purification. It's very disciplined, it's very targeted, and it's nonviolent, and it's something that you use to change laws by breaking them, but you do so with a moral purpose. And the purification process is you're highly trained to remain nonviolent, even in the face of attacks, physical attacks. And to me, that says it all, you know. It's disciplined, and it's nonviolent, and it's targeted.
Yeah, one of the difficult things about protests and the optics of protests is that they often, I think, start based on legitimate grievances and trying to right a wrong or call attention to a wrong, but you can have a few people who behave lawlessly or behave destructively, and then suddenly that becomes the narrative of the protest, and it's not a protest anymore, it's a riot, at least if you watch the news. And I think a lot of times that can undermine the original intent of the protest and the protesters. So as someone who plans, and I mean, Newburyport is a bit of a different animal, but as someone who plans and organizes rallies, how do you go about making sure that these things are peaceful and that everyone remains aligned on their the way they demonstrate?
We do a certain amount of training for marshals. We appoint people to be peace marshals. And the biggest thing is you tell people if somebody, like we always get somebody driving by with a rude gesture or they yell a swear out the window. And you just have to expect, you expect that.
Right.
Don't engage. Just don't engage.
Because the smallest provocation
Right.
to someone who has a bit of a temper
Right.
can ignite.
Well, you want to, you want
Sure.
to, if somebody spits at you and yells something at you, your impulse is to go back at them, but you can't do that. You have to really be disciplined, and you just have to say to yourself, I am not going to engage with this person because that's what they want.
Yeah, in Amesbury, there was a recent incident, I think, where there's a Trump parade or caravan of cars, and the councilman threw himself on the hood of the car.
I don't know anything.
And
I've never heard of that.
I didn't know about that till you wrote
Oh, yeah.
about that.
Yeah, no, that was, I think, this past year or maybe late last year, and that became, the story is like this crazy councilman. His form of protest was to throw himself on the hood of this car, and then he got arrested and whatever. And that's not non-violent. That could endangers the car, endangers himself.
Right.
But in his mind, in that moment, I think that he was so triggered by the Trump caravan that was how he was motivated to respond. And
So to respond to what you both said, you have to have a conscious sense. That's why the training is good, to remind people. You have to have a conscious sense of what you're there for. And if you're there to create justice, if you're there to right a wrong, engaging in something that may not be wrong but may make what you're standing up for look wrong, is going to be harmful. So you have to have control all the time. You taught, I taught.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been in the classroom when students have said things that drive me crazy, but they'll never know that. They'll never know that because, there's a larger goal there. And I think that when you're out protesting, if to use justice as just an umbrella word, if justice is the goal, then behaving in a way that can be defined as injustice, even though it may not be, is harming the goal. So you have to keep that goal in mind.
Right. Well, and what is the goal? So, as someone who organizes these things, what is the goal to? Is it a success if you affect change, or is it a success if everyone goes out there and finds a sense of community and goes home in one piece? As an organizer, what's your barometer for a successful protest?
I think a success could be a number of things, not just one or the other. I think we certainly want to grow the movement, and I keep thinking of Robert Hubbell's famous saying now, this will stop when more of us say no. We want to get to that critical mass of more people saying, this is not acceptable, and we're not going to put up with it anymore, and you need to stop. And I think, for me personally, I would love to see, and it's going to be a tough thing to organize, a general strike. And they had one in Minneapolis recently. That protest was not only a protest, it was a general strike, and the clergy engaged in acts of civil disobedience at the same time. They marched to the airport, and they were arrested because they sat down. And that was very disciplined. The unions were involved. A whole bunch of the store owners bought in, so you need a buy-in from a lot of different community
Can you
groups.
define a little more specifically general strike? Do you mean like an economic, people don't shop on a certain day? Because they did that, I think, this past Friday or 2 Fridays ago.
Right.
Some stores did that in solidarity with
Right.
Minnesota. But is that what you mean? So it's like people shut down their shops. What else?
They don't go to work.
Okay.
They don't buy things, It could be different things in different places, but in Minnesota, specifically, that seemed to be very successful because many of the businesses participated, and they certainly got the message out around the country.
Yeah, that's interesting to me, the general strike thing, because I fully understand why that's effective. because more than just people standing outside holding signs, it's like
Right.
it's like a total war response. But I can also see people saying, well, it hurts small businesses, and if you're encouraging people not to shop, or giving people opportunities to support local business, or you're shutting down, not essential services, but services like, airports, or if not enough people show up to work, then people can't. It disrupts the flow of, air travel or whatever it might be. At what point is the disruption not worth it anymore, or harmful to the community in a way that outweighs the ideological benefit you're striving for? And there's no real answer concretely
No.
for that, but I do think that's something that I wonder about when I see people protesting in that way, even though the underlying issue I might fully support. I always wonder, how long is that sustainable for, and how effective is it? Because it's really an abstract thing that it's hard to weigh its effectiveness until you see a government response weeks down the road.
But that is the point. The point is to disrupt, because the direction that things are going in is becoming, and I'm not talking specifically now about what's going on now, but in general, the direction that things are going in is becoming increasingly wrong, increasingly harmful, increasingly dangerous to a democracy if you're living in one. And at some point, you have to make a decision that you have to put a stop to it. And you put a stop to it and strikes that you're talking about are temporary anyway. You put a stop to it by a kind of a strike. You give people a chance to kind of step back, who haven't thought about things like the ones you see it demonstrating, who've never been there before. Because the larger goal, to use, and I'm using this word generically, is justice. Is justice. And if that means that, somebody can't go shopping one particular day, you have to weigh one thing against the other, is what you have to do.
And you'll really be inconvenienced if we lose our democracy.
Sure.
It won't be good for small
Took the
business
words
or any
right out of my
business.
mouth. Exactly right.
Think
Exactly
about,
right.
what we're dealing with here.
Think about Germany. We just went past Holocaust Remembrance Day.
Yeah.
What if people had acted sooner? And not just Germany, not just the Holocaust. The millions of people who were killed as a result of that, soldiers and others. What if that strike, there'd been a strike, or there'd been an action that stopped it from happening? And I know maybe I'm being a little bit, overly optimistic, but I think at some point you just have to do that.
Yeah, well, it's almost like relying on the overwhelming power of public opinion to force the government, or the oppressive power, in whatever case it might be.
Or to send the message. Sorry.
Right. No,
to send the message out there so that people know what's going on.
And Abraham Lincoln said it. He said, you can do nothing without public opinion.
Right. If we're going to save the democracy right now, Franklin, a republic, if you can keep it, if we're going to keep the republic now, and this is just my opinion, I'm not relying on my congressman. I am relying on my neighbors. I believe it's my neighbors. It's the people out on the street. It's the people organizing. It's the people talking to one another. It's the people writing postcards. If enough of us get together, that's what's going to save us. That can't be corrupted. It can, but it's much harder to corrupt a gigantic number of people. So, and it's worked in the past. That's how democracy happened.
Right, and I think there's two views of it. You can take more of a macro view, is more of a nationwide protest, economic blackout. It's not mutually exclusive. You can do both. And a more micro view, and I've talked to people who are more in favor of doing this, at least in their own personal lives, is small acts of kindness and community, and almost we can't have an impact on national events, but we can help our neighbors who might be in trouble. We can help, people in Minnesota who are, their neighbors might be getting their doors knocked down by ice and can't go shopping for food or supplies. They might not be out there in the streets marching, but maybe they're going and buying them supplies or food so they don't have to leave the house. So things like that. And I think that's almost, the more I've talked to people about this lately, the more that seems to be a school of thought of their preferred form of protest, rather than kind of a traditional means of going out and holding a sign. They tend to small acts of kindness and supporting people in their community. And I think you can do both or all or one or the other. And I think there's no right or wrong.
Well,
they
both,
intersect.
absolutely.
Yeah, they intersect. When you do the small acts of kindness, you're growing the community. When you grow the community, it's much harder for people to come in from the outside and break it down.
Autocrats do not want people to feel a sense of community because it's a threat to them.
Exactly.
So I almost see those things as acts of opposition in their own right.
Absolutely.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
It's just
Anytime you're
different
together,
ways.
with other people,
Yeah.
you're a community.
Yeah.
Community threatens them.
Well, let's talk about the optics of protests and the idea of public pressure and public opinion, and I think the way that comes across visually, because protests take place in public squares, public streets, public spaces. I know, Lois, we've talked about the role of public spaces in protesting and how important they can be. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I call public space democracy's front porch. And the reason I think it's democracy's front porch, and the reason I think public space is so important, is because public space is a place you can interfere with people who are there protesting or doing things, but you do not have the right to demand that people speak a certain way, the way you would in a church, the way you would in a school, the way you would in some kind of federal building. Public space is where people, the individuals, have the right to gather. And, the Greeks believed in that. That's why they set up places like the Agora where people could meet together. They thought it was very important to have public space where people could actually discuss issues where they didn't agree, but maybe come to decisions with one another that weren't violent in any way. So public space is a place where you can, speak to the issues, but it's a place, most importantly, where you can gather and you can stand against the private spaces where you feed democracy. It's democracy's front porch, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, it's making yourself unignorable almost.
It also acts as a pressure valve
Sure.
for society. If people couldn't protest and express themselves, what would happen? I shudder to think.
Yeah. I always think it's funny because when I hear complaints about protests, or it's funny, it's like, I was trying to enjoy my nice day in Newburyport, a summer day, and I had to walk through the peace protest on Sunday in Market Square. They're taking out Market Square. Well, where do you want them to protest? Like on a parking lot, the industrial park, where no one's going to see them? It's like the whole point. Or even on High Street, it's like, they're clogging up the street and there's all these people, it's slowing down traffic. It's like, well, that's kind of the point. Like it's a public, you use a public space in a lawful, civil way, and you want attention. The whole point is to get attention. It's not to hold a private party.
And those people who are upset, when things go far enough, what Reverend Niemöller said, I don't remember the exact, but first they came for this and I wasn't at that, so I didn't do anything, and then they came for this one, and by the time they came for me, there was no one to protest. Those people who are annoyed that they can't drive down High Street, they're on the list too. They're just lower down on the list than some of the rest of us.
Well, what if ICE comes into Newburyport and they're out eating in a restaurant and all the restaurant workers get dragged out and their meal is disrupted? Or they're blocked off by ICE vehicles or pulled out of their cars and stopped and they have to show their papers to prove they're citizens. I don't think they'd be too happy. And thankfully, I think those people are in a small minority.
Right. Yeah.
It's a minority that's getting smaller.
Yeah.
And it's getting smaller because the people who are speaking out are getting larger. It's a larger crowd. And, there's always that thing where people join the crowd. Maybe they don't join it for ethical reasons, but they want to be part. I saw that with the Vietnam demonstrations. I don't know if you did. They want to just be out there. But they weren't hurting anybody either. And those people, eventually, many of them did begin to understand the reason behind it.
And that's their problem. I mean,
Yeah.
you can educate people as much as you want, but
Well, so Vietnam, I'm glad you brought that up. It's something I was not alive for, but
oh, thank you for reminding us how old we are.
And I'm even older
Not to
than
age
you.
anybody or de-age myself, but growing up, when I thought about protests, that was what I thought about. I thought about the
Vietnam,
Vietnam
yeah.
protests, protests of the Vietnam War
'Cause there were a
and
lot
the
of
draft, and I was like, oh, that must be so horrible. And now we have everything that's going on now, and people who remember those protests and protested in them are now organizing protests now. So I'm interested in, as someone who had been there for both, how does this moment and these movements to respond to that moment the same or different than the Vietnam, and how is the mood? I think every generation kind of tends to feel that they're living through an existential crisis of the country, and that every generation is at the end of history, and that motivates them to get out there and to protest. When I was growing up, I was too young to care that much about this, but when George W. Bush was president and the Iraq War, and people were protesting the Iraq War, and everyone was throwing around words like, we have, an authoritarian government that's forcing us to go to war. And I was like, I was in middle school or whatever I was, like early high school, and I was like, oh my God, like this is the worst of times. And I think we always seem to feel that whatever time we're living through is the worst of times. And I'm sure you guys probably feel that way right now. So since you've lived through a couple of worst of times, how's that changed, and how does this moment feel different?
Well, I'll speak personally. For me, when I was younger and protesting Vietnam, there really was no infrastructure of opposition. It slowly built with all the groups. And I didn't feel compelled to join anything like the Democratic Party, because that was the establishment. And now, as a fully grown adult, after Trump was elected, as I told you, 2016, I just didn't know what to do. I was so upset and disturbed and concerned for the country. So I joined the City Democratic Committee, and which has grown and also stepped into the void and helped organize some of these protests, and now we're the main organizer of the weekly protests. So that structure was there, and they've been responsive, and I really appreciate that.
It is interesting how, and we'll let you respond to that too, but it's interesting how in Vietnam the people were protesting against the establishment, right? And now the people protesting are protesting on behalf of the establishment in a way, not the government, but in establishment norms and of guardrails in support of the status quo, the way things have always been in government. And people who are out there protesting, I think, long for when government worked, long for bureaucracy, long for the slow democracy that we used to have, and against the fast-paced executive action of Donald Trump. And I think it's interesting how those two things have kind of flipped a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm 100% right, but my perception at least is that when I was out protesting Vietnam, it was wrong, but I did not feel that the guardrails of democracy were coming apart.
Right.
I felt that there were some people in power who were wrong, that they had to be corrected, and we had to keep at it until they were. Right now, I feel that the guardrails of democracy are coming apart. Again, this is personal. I feel that we are at the most dangerous point, and I'm over 80, I'm sorry to say, in my memory, in my life. And my brother says to me periodically, because my father fought in the Second World War, he was 28 years old, he didn't have to go. He signed up anyway. And he says to me periodically, what do you think Dad would think? Mm-hmm. And that becomes something, a way of looking at things. Mm-hmm. Even then, things weren't as bad as they are now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wonder, and I think I know the answer to this, but do you think that protests worked in the Vietnam era? And I think within the guardrails of democracy, the instrument to affect change within a democracy is protest. And that's something that we've always been taught and we've always exercised. I'm asking if you think within the guardrails of democracy, of a country that still operates within the same constrictions that it did during, the 17, 1800s, protesting works. But now, given the upending of the normal order of things, is protesting still an effective tool, or is something else required? Is something more? I don't have an answer to that. Okay. But am I putting the question clearly?
No, I have an answer. I don't know if it's right,
yeah.
But I think protesting is all we have. And I mean protesting in every sense of the word, whether it's being out on High Street, whether it's striking, whether it's writing letters, whether it's talking to your friends. I think protesting is the only weapon we have right now. And growing the protest as much as possible, and again, I don't mean into violence, I mean growing by spreading out the numbers of people who are engaged and involved, and I think that is happening. If you look only and solely at Trump's, the numbers of support are going down, and there are people who voted for him and supported him who are beginning to say, well, I didn't sign up for this. Protesting gets people engaged and tells them what's going on. It makes it harder to ignore what's going on.
And when the government makes you afraid, makes its citizens afraid of its own government, when Kent State happened, that was a tipping point. And these 2 murders in Minnesota, I think that those are also tipping points where people feel personally threatened by their own government. How un-American is that? Trump today, or yesterday, the FBI raided ballots in Georgia. They seized control of the Georgia 2020 ballots and took custody of those. That is frightening to me. Yeah. That's not okay.
Right.
In what world is that okay?
And what are they going to do in the next election? Are they going to look at how you're registered as a Democrat, an Independent, or a Republican, and somehow prevent Democrats from voting?
And they're busting down doors saying that the Fourth Amendment, the right to protection in your own home, they can do it without a judge's warrant. They just can write their own warrants and come into your home.
And arresting 5-year-olds.
And that's, come on, that's not acceptable. Yeah. And I think people are starting to say, no, you've gone too far, and we're not going to put up with this anymore.
And because we still live in a democracy right now.
Thankfully.
Right, that public pressure pays off. And I think it does move the needle a little bit. If we were to live in a truly authoritarian state, I don't think it necessarily would. So I think that was what I was getting at with my previous question was, if you don't live in a democracy anymore, protesting isn't going to get you anywhere. But because we do, and you can argue on what end of the spectrum we're at, I think that's still one of the best tools we have.
I think we have a government that a group of people who want to exert dominion over the rest of us, and they're using unconstitutional, illegal means to do so. And the people are, more people are starting to see this, and we still have the right to protest still, but we could easily become Iran, where people just are indiscriminately killed in the streets for protesting. I mean, I think that's the end. That's where we're headed towards. So we need to stop this now.
Yeah. So I mean, I try to be so that I can sleep at night. a little more optimistic, and I want to go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is I think we're different than Germans, I think we're different than the French, I think we're different than the British in one way. They did not grow up with democracy as the measure of government. And I really do believe that, being born into a world where it's only about democracy, that gets inside you, and I think we are less likely, at least I'm hoping that's what I'm counting on, to give in. To give in. Than
Well, I think,
other places did.
I think somebody was even quoted from the administration in Axios saying they were hoping this whole thing would just blow over and people would forget about it.
So what would you say to someone who is a little apathetic about protesting, about politics, about the government, who, agrees essentially with you guys, but who doesn't see the point in getting off the couch and joining a protest, who doesn't think it moves the needle, who can't see a tangible result? So they say, what's the point? So what would you say to motivate that person to, give it a
I'd
shot?
ask them why. I'd start out
Ask them
by
why.
asking why. Why are you not motivated? What is it that, and in a very quiet, kind way, non-threatening way.
You wouldn't scream at them and slap them around?
God, no. I want to understand where you're coming from so I can understand. Could you explain that to me? And I would hope that would open up a conversation. To go back to the Greeks, that's what agon is, getting people to talk to each other. I would hope it would open up a conversation which maybe wouldn't be resolved in that one conversation, but perhaps could create a relationship where that conversation could go on, or maybe something else that would... Can I go back to history for just 1 second? To Amos Lawrence. Amos Lawrence was a cotton Whig. This is during the 19th century. And he got a benefit from slavery, obviously, because he got cheaper materials. And then when the 1850 fugitive slave law came about and they took Anthony Burns and sent him back in 1854, Amos Lawrence was changed completely, and he wrote about it. He said, we woke up one morning, it's not the exact words, but, crazy abolitionists. And then what did he do? He had a ton of money. He sent people out to Kansas so that from Massachusetts, so they would vote for Kansas to be a free state. That was huge.
Right.
Lawrence, Kansas is named after him. Lawrence, Mass is named after him. The Lawrence School in Brookline is named after him. But that one moment in history changed him, and he changed history. So again,
So people who think that,
he changed.
one person can't make a difference.
One person can
yeah.
make a difference, and he was changed by what happened. Nobody even talked to him. He just saw it. 50,000 people showed up in Boston when they tried to send Burns back. That's
Think
a
of
lot
our
of
own
people.
American Revolution.
Right.
We're celebrating 250 years, and I've gone to lectures about the local activists in Newburyport at the time, and they made a difference. They put stuff in the harbor to keep the British ships from being able to enter the Merrimack. They put lookouts on to relay what was going on with the British movements of troops. They had committees of correspondence between all the towns, so they were ready in a moment's notice to react. And any kind of social movement is always started by people,
Yes.
ordinary people.
Agreed.
And-
And history, we have to, I mean,
You have to look
we
at
just
history.
gave two
Yeah,
examples
absolutely. Yeah.
from our own history. You know,
Gandhi, look what Gandhi did in India.
Gandhi carried Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience with
Wow.
him.
So one eye sparks the other. It's like a light that gets
Yeah,
passed
and
on.
then King learned
Yeah.
from Gandhi,
Right.
right back to this country. That's what I hold on to. And that's what I'm going to continue to hold on to until they drag me away, if they do.
We're going to make sure nobody throws you away.
I think that's an optimistic note to end on. Not that you getting dragged away part, but unless there's anything, last closing thoughts, we've got a minute or two before Maeve kicks me off the air.
No, I've said enough, I
that
think.
you guys want to mention? Okay. Well, hopefully we unpacked a complex subject reasonably
Agree
well
that you
in
can.
45 minutes. But I want to thank you guys again for coming on. Great discussion. And thanks to Maeve, our producer, Sarah, head of NCM Studios. And thanks to everyone for watching and listening. We'll see you next month.
And thanks for having us.
Thank
to
you for
have this
having us.
discussion. It's an
Bye-bye.
important one.